I'm very pleased to turn the proceedings over to my colleague Susan Pedersen, who's just finished a big work on the culture, the institutions around the League of Nations and the mandate system. So, different, very important perspective. Susan.
All right, well, I'm actually going to turn it over to my dear old friend and colleague, Larry Wolff, who is chairing this session, and I'm sure you all know his work. He's the historian of Eastern Europe, the Balkans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, many things, and has written very widely on those subjects, and is now professor of history at NYU.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you all for being here on what may turn out to be one of the coldest days of this winter, very likely. Thank you so much, Vicki, for setting up this brilliant event, Bicentennial Congress about the Congress. Really fantastic idea. There'll be three speakers. I'll introduce them as they are about to speak. The first speaker is Glenda Sluga. We've known each other for a long time, since back in the end of the last century when we were both very involved on the Adriatic.
Thank you.
Well, it was the last century. We were both very engaged with the Adriatic issues at that time, and out of it came Glenda's wonderful book on the problem of Trieste. But she has since then published a variety of works that are focused on internationalism and very relevant to thinking about international congresses like the Congress of Vienna. She wrote a book about the nation, psychology, and international politics, and most recently, the year before last, a book on internationalism in the age of nationalism. And Glenda's going to speak today on the subject of women, men, and the making of modern international politics.
All right. Thank you very much, Larry. So this is my second go. I've had a chance to already speak yesterday. And I just wanted to acknowledge, I was looking before at Dag Hammarskjöld, who's probably enjoying this conversation. I can imagine him enjoying the discussion about the Congress of Vienna and its contemporary significance, although he might be wondering why we're not talking about Bernadotte in Sweden. But the panel is focused today on, this morning, on communicating the values of the Congress. And in that context, I just want to try and link what I'm about to talk about to the discussion that's been going on, and to say that I see my discussion of women, men, and international politics as addressing some of the questions that have come up about the significance of the French Revolution in terms of values and responses to those values, political values, about the ideological drivers, and we've heard about perpetual peace, but we haven't heard much about liberalism, and I'm going to raise that topic, and to be asking, coincidentally, I suppose, the question, what constitutes a legitimate area of discussion for international politics, or what did in that period, and how that got defined. Also, to address the question of the construction of the international, the historicisation of that idea, to which you'd want to add, I think, the contemporaneous construction of the state. And if we're thinking about security and the history of security, then the shift from the idea that the individual's security is chief to the notion that it's the state security that has the prerogatives in political discussions. And further, to think more about the role of individuals in this story. The significance of Paul Schroeder's work, I think, is clear. Methodologically, though, he's very interesting. He addressed the question of the Congress of Vienna in the 1990s at a time when people were becoming more interested in the international as opposed to the significance of the national. And in that context, I think not necessarily wanting to praise rather than condemn the Congress, but to investigate its significance in the history of the conceptualisation of international politics in that space. But he was keen to move away from the key figures, from individuals, to think about structures. It was a particular methodological moment. And in this paper today, I want to go back to individuals, but I want to suggest that we need to take in a broader array of individuals in order to understand or to ask questions about how did politics work in this period? How did people think about power? And how did values get communicated? As we've seen over the past day, the Congress of Vienna lies only problematically at the heart of an historical narrative of the modern transformation of European politics, setting new thresholds of international political cooperation and coordination in the interests of peace, and identified as the concert of Europe. Its modernity was constituted by the coincidental emphasis placed in its debates and outcomes on an international, or more usually European politics, and the public law of state legitimacy, on the promise of a structured science of government and the ambiguously public-private practices of political congressing, often represented as characteristic of the cosmopolitan values and practices of the Ancien regime. So in my talk, I want to briefly explore this conjunction of the new and the old in terms of both the Congress values and its method of communication in the context of the creeping popularity of the adjective international and the specific evidence of the agency of individual women, none of whom, it has to be said, that I'm discussing today were actually at the Congress, a strange choice given that there were more women at the Vienna Congress than any Congress before or since, according to one historian. Few of the sources I draw on are part of the public archive of the Congress, and to some extent they reinforce the idea that Metternich posed that, in fact, it's the secret sources of Congress intimacy that may have been the sole domains of real power. My aim is to address this secret public divide and bring into clearer focus the breadth of politics relevant to our understanding of the fashioning of Congress values and the alignment of those values with the contemporaneous gendered identification of modern European public political life. So my first woman is probably the best known to you, Germaine de Stael. And while there are many directions that a focus on her might take, here she introduces us to the importance of the pre-Vienna Paris Congressing in establishing Congress values and the roles of an exceptional woman in the conceptualisation and communication of those values. At the same time as Jeremy Bentham was touting his constitution writing skills in anticipation of peacemaking outcomes, Stael was busy actively inserting her liberalism, a term she is credited with coining, into peacemaking debates and the historical accounting of the Congress. Maurizio Isabella has confirmed that Stael's rendition of the French Revolution up to the events of the Congress, her uncompleted and posthumously published Considérations sur la Révolution française, was critical to the articulation of the moderate liberalism of the post-Napoleonic era. More specifically, Stael long stood at the centre of French and Swiss anti-slavery activity that was also part of the Congress agenda. In 1814, she was producing essays and pamphlets that attempted to persuade the negotiators of the Treaty of Paris to add as conditions of the peace the following: the abolition of the slave trade, military action against political tyranny, and on behalf of constitution-based political societies. If she was only one actor among a school of British and other activists, hers was a singular elaboration of the philosophical and practical terms of the universality and international legitimacy of liberalism that became the conceptual axis of a European or even transatlantic post-war political debate, post-Napoleonic War political debate, as she described in her book, Considérations. Is the question the abolition of the slave trade or the liberty of the press or religious toleration? Jefferson thinks as Lafayette, as Wilberforce, and even they who are now no more are reckoned in the Holy League. Is it then from the calculations of interest? Is it from bad motives that men so superior in situations and countries so different should be in such harmony in their political opinions? Stael's correspondence shows that as she moved between Paris and Geneva between 1814 and 1816, she assiduously kept up a network of correspondence, the Tsar, Wellington, Jefferson, among others, and developed sturdy lines of political information connecting her to the major international discussions concerning Europe and the Americas. Although the negotiations of the Treaty of Paris that took place a few months before the Vienna Congress was a less celebrated affair, at stake here too, where she was most dominant, were the details of France's future and the status of colonies, European rivers, trade and abolition, and the principles of diplomacy on which a commitment to harmony and understanding between all the states of Europe might be based. As importantly, all the key figures attended her salon. For American Ambassador John Quincy Adams, that salon was a kind of temple of Apollo where one could meet the world. But it's also clear that at that salon, she took responsibility for directing conversation to the ends of her liberalism, as she understood it. Constitutional guarantees against abuses of political power, and in defence of freedom of religion, press and association, meritocratic rather than hereditary government, the cultivation of public opinion in thriving public spheres. Already laid out in her earlier publications and through her correspondence and salons, she regarded these points as directly relevant to the French polity on the grounds of their universal applicability. It wasn't just the British that had the right to these ideas. In this context, style provides a rare benchmark for the limits of the liberal modernity for which the Congress might stand. Her political successes, and she took some credit for the generous treatment of France in the First Treaty of Paris, for example, are less apparent than her failure to influence the Vienna outcomes. And she herself denounced them as all those political reasonings on the balance of Europe, those old systems which serve as a pretext to new usurpations. A noticeable world weariness strained her summation of political progress in Vienna. A world spectacle made to inspire sadness, with the only consolation that discontent is being aroused. She saw in English political behaviour there, in Ireland and abroad the precedent that explained the English disregard for liberty at the Congress. This was a huge step for her because she was such an Anglophile. But she blamed not only Castlereagh, but also the self-interest of Talleyrand, who made a small fortune out of the Vienna decisions, and she had also made Talleyrand's career. From her perspective, by 1815, a long-anticipated opportunity to reshape political institutions in the image of liberty had been lost. And historians of her ideas tend to argue that the 1830 revolutions are the fruition of her influence in that period. Just briefly, Caroline Humboldt, the wife of Wilhelm Humboldt and Frederica Brun, their correspondence is also interesting. Brun was a Danish salonier who modelled her salon on Stahl's. They both knew Stahl quite well. And their correspondence around the Vienna Congress pressed the question of the, presses for us, I think, the question of the influence of individual women, even when they weren't present at the conference, and of correspondence as evidence of a contemporary mood, of the broader circulation, if not origin, of ideas, of the extent to which values represented by the Congress were discussed and questioned while it was in progress, and the extent to which they turned on questions of political patriotism, cultural hierarchies, and the limits of women's political agency. I'll just give you some samples. So in 1815, you get Brun and Humboldt writing back and forth, dismayed at the cynicism being practiced at the Congress, but also at their own views of what the empire of right and justice, as they called it, might look like. For example, Humboldt, who kept urging her husband to deny Jews' rights at the Congress, for example, would write to Brun saying, the Italians are not yet ripe, unlike the Germans. It sounds very early 20th century. Brun would agree, about Italy, I now think as you do, these better ones think they are still in the 13th to 14th century, but they had their own views about the importance of working toward the union of nations that belong together. Brun argued at various times that serious justice is the true God, that the German, a category in which she included herself and Humboldt, and the English count as the most noble peoples on earth. And I think there is something about the modernity represented, the political modernity represented by the British state and the Prussian state that is very significant in this period. And they also agreed that political incitement in women is something that they hated to death. Through it, we become furies, and they were thinking of Stahl's political involvement at in those events. So taken together, Brun, Humboldt, Stahl lay out the spectrum of ideas that comprised the liberal trend set by Napoleon's defeat, according to Schroeder. That is, in Schroeder's terms, launching Europe on a century of genuine political, social and economic progress. And these were namely the values of secular liberalism, patriotic nationalism and bourgeois gender norms. They also remind us, I think, of the diverse strands of cosmopolitan and national thought in this period and the hierarchical premises that were already embedded in the liberal trend as it would continue to be understood through the 19th century. And my last example, just quickly, is Dorothea Lievin, who takes us into the post-Congress period to the imperative of humanity that was often invoked as an argument for international intervention, and these questions have already occurred in the early discussions. And she was, I think, a key figure. Her agency became vital to the confusion of humanitarian and national ends of the value system that had begun to be normalised at Vienna. And here Stella Gervas's work could tell us more about the status of Hellenism in this period. But I just want to think about again, the role of individual agency, even though I'm not against structures at all, I'm post-structuralist, so even the individual is problematic for me in some ways, but I do think that it's worth returning to a body of historical work, including Cambridge historian Harold Temperley, who confirmed in the 1820s Lieben's claims of having turned Tsar Alexander to a policy of putting the defence of the Christians on the other side of the Russian Empire's borders on the alliance agenda. And we've noted that Tsar Alexander was disinclined for reasons of his commitment to the alliance and the idea of the self-abnegation of state interests. But in fact, in the 1820s, it's Lieben who takes responsibility, and Temperley agrees, for having making him change his mind. I said to him, "Put your foot down, sire, and you'll make the whole world tremble," for that was precisely what the emperor did not think that he would dare to do. And then she then went on to convince George Canning, the British foreign minister with an anti-interventionist reputation, to intervene in the Eastern question on Russia's side, establishing in the East, according to Temperley, an order of things conformable to the interests of Europe and to the laws of religion and humanity. From the 1820s through the historically acclaimed period of a concert-induced European peace, the anti-liberal Lieben used her networks, her correspondence, her salon to great effect, demanding international intervention in support of religiously defined humanitarianism. The end result, not all of her own making, of course, but according to Temperley, was the end of the Neo-Holy Alliance and the congressional or international system of government, and the beginning of the breakup of the Turkish Empire. To the extent that humanitarianism was defined in terms of national emancipation and nationalism was symptomatic of a modernity, Lieben was an important cog in a narrative of the Congress' international significance and the concert as the loci of political and ideological change. So let's stir these women back into the political history of the Congress as, according to Schroeder, the transformation of the governing rules, norms and practices of international politics. Their addition highlights both their individual agency and the collective gendering of international politics that was as important a dimension of this transformation, the resistance to their agency. Stahl articulated and gave force to the liberal tenets of the ideological revolution in international norms that Schroeder associates with this period, the sense of inherent limits, acceptance of mutual rules and restraints, and loyalty to something beyond the aim of one's own state. She also nurtured through her written as well as verbal agenda agency a liberal international agenda that rendered the gendered nation the means to universalist liberal ends. Like Humboldt and Brunn, she actually argued that non-exceptional women shouldn't play a role in politics, and that was one of the issues that was being sort of worked out implicitly. Humboldt and Brunn expanded the spectrum of liberalism in the directions of a Germanic Protestant cultural political collusion, as prone to challenge women's overt political participation despite their own political inclinations. And Lieben's influence can be traced through her promotion of an orthodox, conservative-derived religious humanitarianism. So at a time when nationality had only limited influence on the imperatives of international intervention, these women promoted diverse national and religious patriotisms for divergent reasons, on a European scale through their presumption of political connections. Stirring women back into the history of the Congress places it back in a broader social, economic and cultural rendering of the international political past. It reconnects the public and the secret dancing versions of Vienna and the gendered legacies of not only political agency but of political ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. The second speaker is going to be Margaret Crosby-Arnold. She's a research scholar here at the European Institute at Columbia. She's written a book about the making of a German constitution, which is about 19th century German constitutionalism. And she has a forthcoming book entitled Hannibal's at the Gate, which is about immigration and economic dislocation in revolutionary and Napoleonic Europe. She's going to speak today on the subject of race, legal fiction, and the Congress of Vienna, unwitting errors, global haunting, and the continuing legacy of a dangerous superstition in today's world.
Great.
Please.
Thank you. You all have also a timeline, which is sort of a help aid through my talk today. And I'm going to dive right in. In September of 1799, after Britain's devastating loss of some 28,000 troops in a failed attempt to take the French colony of Saint-Domingue, General Thomas Maitland wrote to King George III on, quote, the measures which ought to be immediately adopted in Jamaica to put the valuable island in such a respectable state of security and defense as must naturally ensure the failure of any attempt that may be made against it, either by open force or concealed intrigue. The King was, quote, already in possession of the latest intelligence on the measures adopted there to keep the Negro chief Toussaint in such a disposition towards the British government as not to attack Jamaica. The principal and sole object, as your grace is well aware, he continued, for any connection was even entered into with the black chief was merely as a precautionary measure, and through this means to secure the island of Jamaica against attack. Whether or not the deal was strictly adhered to was simply immaterial. The governor of Jamaica may indeed be insulted and degraded by having to deal with a Negro, but tough luck. He was going to have to suck it up and ensure that he did not make Toussaint his, quote, inveterate enemy. It would also be necessary, Maitland went on, to a controversial topic, namely black troops. Although the troops must at present be composed of Europeans, it would be impossible to carry on the service without black troops in the West Indies, he wrote. No troops but black, he wrote, can act with effect or with a possibility of existing for any length of time in the West Indies. The question was not whether black troops were desirable, but whether under the complete, quote, change in the system of war, which has taken place there as a consequence of the French Revolution, black troops are now necessary, though they may in themselves be considered an absolute evil. There was ample evidence, he went on, of white troops simply not being able to repel a black invasion, and here he reminded the King, of course, of the Maroon Wars. The solution to the temporary evil of black troops would simply be to quietly draw them back as circumstances permitted. So Roos diplomacy of various kinds and various sorts was the order of the day until fortune presented an option for getting rid of the evils of what Maitland variously called the revolutionary system of France or the French mania. Fortune arrived in the form of the coup of 18 Brumaire and Napoleon's coming to power. Already on Christmas Eve, the members of the new Council of State were sworn in. But in a letter on Christmas Day, 1799, Bonaparte, as first consul, made peace overtures to George III. He asked if, quote, the war that has raged over 4 regions of the world for 8 years should be internal. Why are the 2 most enlightened nations of Europe sacrificing, quote, commercial good and domestic prosperity and the happiness of families for dreams of grandeur in vain? Napoleon's overture was promptly rejected on New Year's Day, 1800. In his letter to Talleyrand, Foreign Secretary William Grenfell emphasized that the original causes of the war had, quote, not ceased to operate. The, quote, system that led to France's, quote, present miseries enveloped Europe in a, quote, tedious and distinctive warfare commenced and prosecuted on principles long since unknown to civilized nations, so long as that system which had disrupted, quote, the stability of property and social order prevailed in France, there could be no peace. So this paper seeks to shed light on the social order question as it related to racial order in this period, a question that was not only inextricably bound to notions of stability of property, but was also a major international factor that shaped strategic aims and conflicts in the period. It was precisely revolutionary France's progressive extension of equal rights to people of color from 1791 and the ultimate abolition of slavery in 1794. And the installation of colorblind democracy that Britain referred to as disrupting the stability of property and social order. This was seen as such a threat to the economic security that its reversal, and by any means necessary, was an unconditional demand of the Peace of Amiens. Now, it's important to keep in mind here that diversity simply is not new. I'm not going to talk about all the images that I'm going to show here, but these are 18th century images here of people of color in Europe. This takes us back to the Battle of Parkenay. These are soldiers of color, quite obviously in the Ottoman military. All right, so this takes us, people of color, deep into Central and Eastern Europe. Again, here, this is Maurice von Saxe, or Maurice du Saxe, who of course became Marshal of France, and while serving in the Saxon armies had been exposed to diversity in the Ottoman army, and he replicated this in France. So you see Saxe here, and then mounted on horseback in the background are his Saxe Volontaires, which was a troop of soldiers of African descent. And they served, as you can see, circa 1745 in the north of Europe at the Battle of Fontenoy and elsewhere, and continue to live on in Europe. They don't leave, all right? Again, he also puts together a troop of Turkish soldiers, and here he is on the battlefield with his Turkish soldiers, painted here, all right? So the military is a key area of the for social integration and social mobility of people of color in Europe over the course of the 18th century, all right? A key site of this. But again, there were others, Turkish musicians in Sweden, all right? One of the leading composers of the period in France, in fact, tutor to Marie Antoinette, Chevalier de Saint George, all right? Here, this is Frederick the Great, all right? Just an ordinary nurse traveling back and forth. So it isn't simply that you have a permanent presence in Europe, but there's always the temporary presence of people traveling back and forth as well, all right? And, you know, I could go on here. This is the Friedrich Martin with his adopted son, right? This is a person often referred to as Baden, but in fact, he's the adopted son of the King of Sweden, all right, which is why he carries the royal names, all right? And this is his diary, which he left behind, all right? So I could go on here, and this is just an ordinary porcelain from a period showing an ordinary guy out on a date, effectively courting. So the sense that I want to give you is that there's tremendous diversity in Europe. This is a list of people simply getting off the boat in Bordeaux. Now here, again, as I've emphasized, it's important to keep in mind that diversity is not new. And all was well until, of course, periods of economic dislocation, most notably the 7 Years' War, where you began to have different responses to diversity. And again, economic dislocation, all of a sudden the rise of anti-immigrant fear, so you can read this for yourselves. Now, I want to give you this sense of this, because effectively what Maitland and the British were calling for was almost impossible. It was going to be quite difficult to roll back the tremendous mobility, social mobility, and integration of sizable populations of people of color in Europe. Diversity could not easily be rolled back, and the demand for same ultimately led to genocide. All right? Still, Civis Comments points towards something, and that is the reality of global economic entanglement. Now, when we put up a map of Europe, we typically put up a map. There are no river systems, there are no whatever, all right? Europe is, in fact, far more fluid than we typically think about. And there was a considerable bit of inland navigation well before the Congress of Vienna, folks, well before the 19th century. In fact, the critical colonial commodities that are coming from Saint-Domingue into Bordeaux or into these various places are being distributed in Europe through the inland waterway system, all right? And so way out along the Rhone and in these areas, there is tremendous communication. Well, with the flow of these goods also leads to the flow of people, so that diversity then is not confined to the coast, but in fact, again, here deep in the interior of Europe. I want to give you a sense then of how interconnected, this is an example of an ordinary water coach that carried passengers or so. And again, give you a sense here of the sense of sugar and the percentages of trade. So the French economy was essentially already global, all right? Where Britain consumed most of its sugar, in fact, the reason for being of the French sugar trade and the colonial commodity trade generally was retrade. So most of the French sugar that arrives in Bordeaux goes to Hamburg, where the largest employment sector is the refinery, refining industry. And again, the sugar is retraded from there once more, dispersed through the river system into Central Europe, and then again all the way out to as far as Russia. The sugar that shows up in Marseille goes to the Levant, or is traded in Italy, on the Italian peninsula, or in the Swiss Alps, or in these areas in here. So you have tremendous entanglement. Tremendous entanglement. So then what does this all mean, ultimately, if you have this economic entanglement? Well, the French Revolution clearly comes along, and this raises questions about the status of persons, all right? And you have all of these very many wealthy, socially mobile people of color, and of course, there is some question about their status. This then leads to a tremendous debate. Ultimately, France moves towards giving people of color who had been free rights and equal rights in France, but what they don't do is take up the question of the status of unfree persons in the colonies, the slaves, effectively. And under the ancient regime, enslaved persons, in fact, enjoyed some measure of legal personality, and when they are denied this, they simply revolt. Well, what is the problem? It creates economic Armageddon in the French economic sphere, right? That's it. The whole economy is based on the trade in these colonial commodities. The entire sphere is disrupted, not simply in the French case, but also with regards to French trading partners. So once France has lost, all right, the production side of the economy, their only option for holding the market, which was Central Europe, was effectively to occupy it, all right? And that then begins to give us another explanation for the wars, the Revolutionary Wars. If you follow the path of French troops, you are effectively following the path of the trade in colonial commodities in Europe in the period from the Revolutionary Wars through the Napoleonic period. Now, so again, Revolutionary France, and you can pick up some of the dates of the emancipation and so on the list that I've given you. But effectively, Revolutionary France had become an egalitarian, multi-ethnic, multicultural society by 1794. Indeed, not only France, but Europe on the whole, over the course of the 18th century, showed a remarkable ability to integrate various peoples. So what happened? What went wrong? Perhaps it was great money, great power interest that effectively got in the way. On the 5th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in 1799, just months before Napoleon would come to power, a celebration was held in Paris. The former revolutionary governor of Saint-Domingue, Etienne Leveau, remarked, quote, "In our colonies, everything is French. This system of absolute unity makes our disconcerted enemies go pale with rage." This was the French mania that Maitland railed against, a sentiment that was shared by other critics of the revolution. Edmund Burke charged that the French had behaved like a bunch of maroon slaves. Gibbon writes the following to his wife about democracy. Effectively colorblind liberty, equality, and fraternity in France and her colonial empire is also what the British in no small measure meant by, quote, the revolutionary system of France. This sentiment was not confined to England and could be heard in the young United States of America. Nathaniel Cutting wrote with disgust of those revolutionaries in France and elsewhere who sought to destroy, quote, the finest colony on earth with their, quote, leveling principles. So as Simon Newman writes, there emerged an increasing fear of both the revolutionary ideology and the social reality of the revolution, especially as it related to the consequences of Saint-Domingue in the 1790s and through the 1800s. This was an international evil, a threat to the interests of the other slave-holding powers, and the expanding numbers of socially mobile freedmen and new Europeans of color was seen as a threat to security. Now, in the meantime, there were free people, free and equal black men wearing the tricolor in Europe. There were generals in the French army in Europe. And you can see here a revolutionary card that emphasizes the virtue of black men as the virtue of courage, largely because they were in the military, all right? And of course, there were men of color serving in the French legislature. Evie Mentor is an example. This is, of course, many people know of Jean-Baptiste Belly, all right? This was an important characteristic of the climate when, in 1801, the new Prime Minister Addington reopened peace deliberations with France. He apparently agreed with Talleyrand that, quote, the interest of the two governments is exactly the same, to destroy Jacobinism, especially that of blacks. As the new foreign minister, Hawkesbury negotiated the Peace of Amiens. Various interest groups wrote to him during the negotiations. Following a meeting with interested parties in London on the 27th of October, 1801, John Turnbull wrote on behalf of, quote, the planters, merchants, and others concerned with the Dutch settlements. Quote, it was, quote, ardently to be wished for that arrangement might be made for the different governments to maintain and support, and if necessary, to aid and assist each other in maintaining and supporting the most correct and proper subordination among the Negroes in all the colonies to which they shall belong. This was cooperation. This was also a call for cooperation, a call for international cooperation to subordinate people of color. This was the international sentiment to which François Courvoisier appealed in his 21 November political and military observations of Saint-Domingue, which effectively laid out the plan for the invasion of Saint-Domingue. He said that the matter was of vital importance, that in the peace negotiations, that it needed to be made clear that this was a threat to, quote, all Europeans. It was an example, a crime without example, that blacks were a, quote, troop of ferocious beasts that could not be allowed to exist. They represented a terrible danger to all Europeans. And of course, they began to imagine the reversal of order that you see here. Now, thus, the 19th century opened with an international demand for the subjugation of people of color, a rollback of a half a century long era of mobility, social mobility, and integration in metropolitan Europe, the Americas, and elsewhere that culminated in the first abolition of slavery in 1794. And this was a rollback by any means necessary. The social order question was an international problem, and emerging cooperation was already evident in the fact that effectively with regards to the Leclerc expedition, even before the ink was dry on the Peace of Amiens, the British were kept informed. And again, you can take James Stevens' comment here. Maitland also responded to the news of the planned expedition and advised Addington on the probable situation of the island after the French force arrived from Europe. If Toussaint were gotten rid of, quote, the black power would still exist. The British might suggest to the French in, quote, the strongest terms, that, quote, if they adopt a line more of coercion, they may succeed. But he emphasized, quote, without exterminating a great part of the present Negroes who they possess, this will be of little use. Finally, Bonaparte's comments leave no doubt about his policy aims. And again, in this environment of economic dislocation was a major driver of anti-immigrant, anti-racial fear in this period. In his 1 July 1802 letter, Bonaparte closed encouraging Leclerc to, quote, rid us of these gilded Negroes, disarming, quote, the blacks and deporting their, quote, principal generals to France would do, quote, more for the commerce and civilization of Europe than all our previous victories combined. It would lend to the French, quote, advantage in German affairs, the largest market in Europe, and an impending peace with Turkey would give France access to the Black Sea commerce. And finally, the Mediterranean advantage of the Italian peninsula. Peninsula. The one thing standing in the way of this was the gilded Africans, all right? So to close, it would seem that the unfortunate history of Napoleon's reinstitution of slavery was in fact, in part at least, significant part, at the behest of the British. It was a demand. It was a condition of the Peace of Amiens. So then these questions were internationalized, all right? And again, the British cooperate with the French in terms of the Leclerc expedition, all right? And one should be concerned, again, giving Rousse's diplomacy. These are some of the communications between Whitworth, who is in Paris, and Hawkesbury. As you can see, they are quite happy to have Napoleon, quote, play their game, all right? And what are British aims here? They say it very clearly, right? They are interested in expanding in the East and West Indies, all right? So there's a lot of this going on surrounding this social and racial question. So the racial question and the social question isn't simply a social question. In fact, it's a high diplomatic question as well. Now, just to give you a sense of briefly what happened on the home front in France once the field is clear and once there is peace, well, there is, of course, the Civil Code project. And in the deliberations for the Civil Code, these questions are taken up. Napoleon, on 4 August 1801, takes up the questions hypothetically about the status of deportees. What would their status be under the Civil Code or under the Constitution? They discussed in some detail the question of civil death, all right? And again, what happens here, to summarize this, is ultimately deportation would equal civil death. One would not have civil status in society or be recognized by the state at all. All right? In the first drafts of the code, which were already in circulation in 1801, in the Book of Persons, every Frenchman shall enjoy civil rights. This is what it said, but of course, by this time, the enjoyment of the identity of French was made contingent on a person's capacity to domicile in metropolitan France. And in 1802, Napoleon hands down this measure, which is effectively a ban on people of color to enter not only France, but the continental territory of the empire on the whole. All right? So effectively, without the ability to domicile in France, it is not possible for blacks, mulattoes, or the catch-all, any other people of color, to enjoy civil rights and identity, not only in France, but in all of the occupied territories of Europe. Now, what is the problem of this? What does this lead to? Of course, the gendarmerie has been expanded. And these deportations, as they are called, in fact, take place. The security, the local police place people of color under surveillance. Lists are made of their locations, information, and so on about them. They are effectively, 2 minutes? Okay, great. Okay, yeah. I'll be done in 2 minutes. They are rounded up. And by 1805, of course, there's no place to deport people. So they are typically held either in old jails in Bordeaux, at Ha, or they are deported to many of these little tiny islands that we never think about off the coast of France, where they are effectively undernourished and they die. All right? So again, this policy, and this is a sense of the list. People of color, their ages, where they were born. Well, this is the best I can do at the moment. But you see these lists, and if you'll see here, this is just one file, folks. This is in the archives. It's one file. It's a bunch of sheets full of little tiny lists of names like the one I just showed you, and these are folks who get rounded up. And that's one file in one archive, and there are many files and many archives, all right? So that France emerges and Europe emerges from the Napoleonic Wars, and I don't like racial terms, but effectively whiter than it ever had been. And in this environment, where you no longer have people of color around to perform the obverse of racial ideologies, such racial ideologies are able to take hold and take root. So this is a key moment then, folks, where you see the enshrining of modern race. Now, I'm not suggesting that race didn't exist before this period. Of course, there were proto-racial forms. But what you see happening under Napoleonic law, and we all recognize this as one of the major modern codes, is you have, for the first time, race enshrined in the law as a legal fiction. All right? To be French, one has to have the ability to domicile in France, and if you are black, mulatto, or any other person of color, you cannot domicile in France. So therefore, at the origins and beginnings of French national identity, there is a racial element that has been overlooked, and this may well explain why we continue to have difficulties in France and elsewhere to this day. None of this was corrected at Vienna. In fact, there was silence on this question, and one has to consider the abolition of the slave trade against the backdrop of the fact that slavery itself had been abolished, right? So the abolition of the slave trade is in fact a half measure, not one that I'm sure we should celebrate, given the realities that Europe had already gone a long ways towards multiculturalism, constructing a multi-ethnic society, and equality. With that, I conclude.
Thank you so much, and I want to apologize for rushing the speakers. We started a little bit late, so I'm a little nervous about getting everything in time. The next speaker on the session will be Christian Cwik from the University of West Indies in Trinidad. He's a specialist in Spanish Caribbean colonial history and broader Atlantic issues as well. And he's going to speak today about the Caribbean and Ibero-America and its impact for the Congress of Vienna and vice versa. Please.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon now. Thank you for the introduction, Professor Wolff. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the team organizing a very good Congress here at Columbia University. It is a little bit easier now to talk because after Margaret's lecture, I think the Eurocentric perspective of the Congress of Vienna is a little bit now farer as it was before. And I want to open the floor here for a global perspective of the Congress of Vienna, or in particular an Atlantic perspective of the Congress of Vienna. The outbreak of the coalition wars from 1792 to 1815 impacted the European colonies on a global level. In Ibero-America and the Caribbean, there was a spread of revolution and the cry for the abolition of slavery as well as the abolition of the slave trade. So this means that when we are thinking about Europe in 1792, as well when we are thinking about Europe in 1814 and 1815, Europe is not only Europe in a continental limitation. Europe is bigger. Europe includes all the colonies of Europe also. So we have to talk about colonial issues. So when we go to the final act of the Congress of Vienna, then we will see that in Article 107 of the final act, the 9th of June 1815, His Royal Highness the Prince Regent of the Kingdom of Portugal and the Brazils, wishing to give an unequivocal proof of his high consideration for his most Christian Majesty, engaged to restore French Guyana to his Saint Majesty as far as the river Oyapock, the mouth of which is situated between the 4th and the 5th degree of north latitude, and which is always being considered by Portugal as the limit appointed by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. So this is, of course, French Guiana is not in Europe. It's a part of the European Union. You know, you can pay there with euro, and if you go by the border, you see the European Union flag, and it's a part of Europe, but it is definitely not in Europe. You need maybe some drugs to understand that it is not in Europe, but it is, of course, in South America. And the South American matter during the Congress of Vienna was an issue. I would say, a Swedish diplomat said, the revolution in the Americas is the revolution in Europe. So revolution is not only an endemic activity of France, the French Revolution. We are talking at this time about the American Revolution, as well as the revolution started in South America. So this was a serious fear among the victorious conservative elites during the Congress of Vienna. Revolutions in America had not one, but many phases. The call for independence, republicanism, democracy, liberalism, social utopianism, and the abolition of slavery, as well as the fight for universal franchise property and many other fundamental changes, like, for example, free trade. Of course, the global wars of the coalition wars were not only wars about political issues. Like many other wars in the world, until today, wars have been fighting for economic reasons. And this is, of course, one of the biggest questions of the time. How the British and their revolution, because the British had also a revolution, it's the Industrial Revolution, we can spread their goods around the world, and we can open the markets of Spain, for example, because the Spanish system was still a system limited to monopolism. So this is the hard question during the Congress of Vienna, how a conservative continental powers, conservative, all still thinking about this old markets, and Great Britain with another vision, idea of a much more free market. I think these are the big questions also during the Congress of Vienna, and I think this South American matter is a very important issue. But it is not only the question of French Guiana in 1814, 1815. If we go to a map of South America, we will see that South America at 1814 is completely covered by European powers. So South America is only in the south. We have an area of Patagonia where still the Mapuche or Araucan Amerindians controlled more or less the southern part of the Cono Sur area of South America, but the rest was more or less covered, I would say officially covered by European powers. So French Guiana in 1814, 1815 was not French Guiana, it was Portuguese Guiana, because it was occupied by Portuguese troops in 1809 by Prince Regent Jean VI with the assistance of British troops. So I would say French Guiana is a British-Portuguese colony, and this is not a big surprise because the Portuguese king escaped from Portugal in 1807/8 with British assistance to Brazil, and Brazil was from 1808, let's say, a Portuguese kingdom, but controlled by British economy. So you have this British influence, of course, in French Guiana as well as in Brazil, and the British tried also to get in the La Plata region at the same time, but they failed against La Plata independence movement. But the neighborhood is Dutch Guyana. But Dutch Guyana, or better known today as Suriname, was not a Dutch colony at this time. It was a British colony, because the British, what they did during the coalition wars, what that they invited in all the Dutch colonies, not only to Dutch Guyana, they invited also to what is better known among us as British Guyana, but British Guyana was also not British before 1814, 1815. It was occupied only by the British, because it was also Dutch, and it was divided in 3 colonies, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice. So the old Guyana issue of 1814, 1815 was a British issue. All this was occupied by Great Britain to protect these colonies from the virus of the French Revolution, and to protect it also from the virus of the Latin American or of the Ibero-American revolutions, because we have here a very crucial person in the north of the Guyaners, because the Guyanas are not only what we know as British, Dutch, and French Guyana. We have also a Spanish Guyana at this time, and this is today Venezuelan Guyana, the region of Guyana, where the capital of today of this Venezuelan would be Ciudad Guyana. There was Francisco Miranda, and Francisco Miranda is a very important personality, because Francisco Miranda, a Venezuelan-born independence fighter, was first fighting in the U.S.-American independence war. Then he was in the French Revolution, and then he shifted his political position to Great Britain. And in Great Britain, he became an agent of British policy for Latin America. So we have a British influence in Venezuela. Also, Great Britain supported Miranda in 1806 for the first time, but the expedition failed close to Coro. It was also supported by Freemasons, so the impact of Freemasonry in the whole issue, also during the Congress of Vienna, is a very important impact, not only in the colonial issues, also in the European issues. But I don't want to say that this is not a European issue, because it was at this time, of course, a European issue, because all these were colonies. So we have then later a second attempt of Miranda in 1811. And then from 1810-11, we have this whole situation, which is close to the Cortes of Cadiz, where we will probably hear Professor Davis today later, that, and this is also British policy. The counter-government of Cadiz is assisted by the British troops. Cadiz cannot exist without British support. So this is the question now during the Congress of Vienna, how we can isolate this question from the Congress of Vienna. And I see that the Congress of Vienna is not only the Congress of Vienna, it is of course the Treaty of Paris, the agreements in London, as well as then when we heard together today and yesterday, of course, all the other congresses today. Mark Jarrett was talking about until Verona in 1822. So we have all these questions also on the floor, and I think it is important to reflect that this also is a US-American history, because the United States of America, they also supported all this movements. So we have, of course, I heard today from Monroe Doctrine and so on, when we are talking about this matter, we have to include that Americans also have their own policy at this time, not only in the Caribbean, also in South America. They supported openly Miranda and all these expeditions to Latin America. Not all, but a lot of them went from US-American harbors like Philadelphia or New York. That's why we have a very close relation to this issue. But also the Saint-Domingue question is a question related not only to the question of slavery, it is also a question touching the issue of the US-Americans. The US-Americans supported Toussaint Louverture's policy in 1800. There is the first more or less agreement between the United States, the Congress of the Continental Congress, and Toussaint Louverture's policy. There's an agreement in 18. You have friendship agreement between these two, let's say, states or political entities. And we have an impact of American policy also in the Saint-Domingue question, but they called Toussaint Louverture that he should declare independence, but Toussaint Louverture didn't declare independence. He said, we are France, we are part of France. That you see here, this is of course also a very important issue, depending the Congress of Vienna, because you have to think the Congress of Vienna as a global event and not only a European event, and the United States of America were, for example, excluded from the official floor of the Congress of Vienna. But if you go a little bit deeper to the Congress of Vienna, you will see that around the buildings where the official Congress had his commission meetings and so on, if you go to the bars around the Hofburg and so on, you will see that there were also discussions in the pubs and the restaurants and so on, and there were, of course, US American people also. So you have conversations. People came out from the Congress of Vienna with the outcomes of the commissions, and they, for payment also, give information to other people. So the spread of the ideas of the Congress of Vienna also reached to persons who were not only involved officially in the Congress of Vienna. But maybe I want to, not to thank you now, to give you also the Caribbean impact of it. Curacao, Bonaire, Aruba, Saint Martin, Saint Eustatius, and Saba, all the Dutch colonies of today, because colonialism is not over, were all occupied by the British. All the other French colonies were occupied by the British. Martinique, Guadeloupe, St. Lucia, all these colonies were at this time occupied by the British. Only Saint-Domingue was not occupied by the British because of the movement of independence, or let's say the revolutionary movement. So we have also British Honduras at this time occupied by the British from the Spanish, and we have also Trinidad occupied by the British in 1797, as well as other places like the Cape Colony. South Africa was occupied by the British from the Dutch, as well as Ceylon, Sri Lanka was occupied by the British. So the British used the coalition wars to do colonial policy, because also they lost in 1783 the 13 colonies in North America. So to substitute this horrible loss, they were seeking for new colonies, as well as the Mosquito Coast and so on. We can talk about, I can talk about hours about the smaller things in the Caribbean occupied by the British. So the question is, if we want to restore now the borders before 1792, before the coalition war started, we should bring all these colonies back to the old owners. And the British were not really interested to give this back. That's why they isolated these matters from the official Congress of Vienna. That's why they had bilateral talks with the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. So finally, the British gave back some colonies. Curacao, for example, Aruba, Bonaire became Dutch again, Suriname also. But for example, Essequibo, Demerara, and Berbice, 3 big colonies in South America, remained British. So there was a success. Also Trinidad remained British. This is a decision of the Treaty of Amiens. And also, all what Napoleon did was under question, the question of what we do with all the agreements Napoleon signed. And there we have the big Louisiana purchase. No? The question is, Louisiana should go back now to France, because it was a business of this horrible guy from Corsica. So we have to bring Louisiana back also to the issue as well. The Austrians said, yeah, and let's talk a little bit about the Austrian Netherlands. So this could be also a question, because this also happened after 1792. So I want to conclude now that the Congress of Vienna was a Congress which dealt with global matters. And I think it is important to realize that a limited European access to the Congress of Vienna doesn't reflect the global world of these days. Because if we talk about now globalization, the world was still globalized. And I didn't talk about that Indonesia was also occupied by the British because it was a Dutch colony. So we have it also an Asian matter, not only a South American matter. I can talk only about South American matters and Caribbean matters. But only it is the beginning of the imperial centenary. The Congress of Vienna opened also the policy which will come to Africa. Africa in 1815 is still a continent with a very small influence of European territory colonialism. I don't want to talk about trade. Trade was, of course, controlled, not completely, but the demands of the market, of the rise of capitalism. This is the next point of the Congress of Vienna, to make a common financial policy. In 1816, the establishment of the National Bank in Austria and other events, aftermath of the Congress of Vienna. I think it's good to understand that the Congress of Vienna is an era. I heard it, an era, or the age of the Congress of Vienna is much more as only the event from September to June. So this is what I want to give you today. Then let's go back to thank you. Thank you for your attention, and have a nice day.
Thank you so much. We'll now have a comment from Susan Pedersen, who requires no introduction here at Columbia. She is a scholar whose work I have long admired. She's the author of a celebrated book on family dependence and the origins of the welfare state in Britain and France. More recently on Eleanor Rathbone and the politics of conscience. And she is about to publish, or perhaps has just published, a new book.
No, it's out in May.
It's out in May. Guardians, about the League of Nations and the crisis of empire. And she'll offer the comment now on the three papers.
Okay, so thank you. I found commenting on these papers quite challenging, partly because I don't work on the Congress of Vienna at all, and I don't work on the early 19th century, but also because they seem at first glance quite disparate. We have a paper that is about, let's say, the gendered politics of diplomacy at the Congress and what people used to disparage as petticoat government. And then we have two papers that are really an attempt to place the Congress, to expand the optic out. They're not about the Congress, they're about the context, and specifically the global context of what happened at the Congress, and particularly, I would say, about the crucial importance of placing that event within the context of a highly global economic order that turned on chattel slavery, an order that was modernizing and not in decline. So it's really an attempt to try and work out the relationship of those things. Now those, so in thinking about how do I put this together, which was really kind of a challenge, what I was reminded of, actually, and I'll just tell you this story a little bit because I think it's historiographically enlightening. About 10 years ago, William Roger Lewis and everyone who was anybody in the big prominent field of British imperial history published the Oxford History of the British Empire, new, great 5-volume study. And at the same time, a kind of new imperial history was bubbling up all over. And there was a sort of explosion when those two things met. And they were symbolized in a way for me by the publication within one volume of a particular little piece called Disease, Diet, and Gender, which was the acknowledgement within the Oxford History of the British Empire, which had about 200 essays in it, that there was something else going on. And it was all kind of shrunk into this one essay with the wonderful African historian from BU, Diana Wiley, having this very taxing job of within 15 pages or so, trying to cover everything that was not part of the canonical Oxford History of the British Empire. And more or less what happened is everybody, who was doing that work kind of rose up and said, you forgot us, you left us out. And if you know what happened to the Oxford History of the British Empire, William Roger Lewis, who is the editor-in-chief, is nothing if not himself an empire builder. He simply incorporated everybody, and there's now about 20 companion volumes who all enact the logic of the supplement by being gender and empire, Ireland and empire, Indians within the British Empire, this sort of thing. There's volume after volume. So I think partly what I wanted to do is say what was, I think, very interesting about that moment was it was a shift in the optic, okay? What Disease, Diet, and Gender did is you all of a sudden said, oh, let's shift the optic. It helped us look at the historiography of the British Empire differently, and perhaps that's what we're doing here, is looking at the historiography of the Congress, or also the Congress itself, differently by placing it in this different context. So that's mostly what I want to say. I'll pull out a few things that I think are really brought out, but I essentially said them already. One is that I think Glenda's paper allows us to ask what was the practice of diplomacy, and is this a key moment in transition within diplomatic practice where something that has been acknowledged as relatively normal, in other words, there's a lot of diplomacy that happens through the private letters and salons in which often aristocratic women are very, very prominent, and they have a kind of acknowledged role doing that work. At least in the British case, you see that continue all the way up to Lady Palmerston, who's very, very interesting. You can look at her diaries about who she's inviting to dinner. It's all about manipulating particular Commons votes. But that kind of work. But these women are also, interestingly, as the Congress becomes something that has to also be in public, working themselves out of a job. And part of, I think, what you're bringing out is the shift in diplomatic practice and in the way things are decided as they become ever more public and as states have to act, playing to a larger realm. So I am very, and always have been, very, very interested in that. This was supposed to be on Congress values, and there the Congress value is partly, I guess, about the shift in diplomatic practice and the way in which gender figures within that. For Margaret Crosby-Arnold, I think partly what you see is the Congress values are about the crucial role played by economic policy in particular, and the threat, the way the abolition of slavery is seen as an absolute global threat to a particular economic system that is developing and in which the British are disproportionately the strongest power. And you then see, essentially through this optic, how a system of racial distinction, the inculcation of racial distinction and the reimposition and strengthening, in fact, of slavery is crucial to the process of working out, Congress values in a way. They are about the reimposition of slavery as well. So I think your strongest claim here, which is worth discussing, is that the important part of the pacification of Europe was this subjugation of people of color. The third point, and this takes me to Christian Cwik, is this point you also made about what we see is not so much a system of peacemaking as a displacement of war to somewhere else. So I would, say that crucial point you say about the British trying to keep colonial issues out of the Congress is that some war will be displaced to somewhere else, and the peace is a confined peace, a peace in Europe, an effort to promote peace in Europe and keep conflict elsewhere. And we see certainly a great deal more of that. As you say, this inaugurates then the century of imperial conquest. So I'll leave it at that. I was going to simply turn over, when I was first asked to do this, I thought Larry and I should just switch roles since he works on this and I don't. But so if he has something to add, I'll leave.
I actually thought that was a great comment. I was very struck listening to the papers that we discussed the values of the conference without reference to ideological conservatism, which was actually the foundational phrase for thinking about the Congress of Vienna back when I first started reading about it, as a student. And when one looks at it from the various points of view of the discussants, it's clear that the sort of roiling aspects of the Napoleonic period are so tremendous that they almost run right through the conference and some of its very, very fragile arrangements and fragile consensus achieved in Vienna. And that was one of the things that emerged for me most strikingly from listening to the three papers. But you've all listened very patiently, and I think if it's okay with the organizers, can we still have a little bit of time for taking comments from the public? Please, let me open the floor.
Yeah, I've been reading about Stuart, the Scottish banker, 1590s, the head of the Bank of England and the West Indies Company with his Darien plan. Darien was Panama. Let's have a Panama Canal, which leads me to think about the Caribbean and this part of the world as a place for big ideas. Now, I know Miranda with Thomas Jefferson. These are people who think big, and you could say the Venezuelan father of independence, our friend Bolivar, United States of South America. I mean, big concepts. In other words, they're not bogged down by an exploitative bias about what we can get out of a particular geographical realm, but we have a future of the world that could be started in this sector. That's what I'm interested in.
We're going to take a few questions before we come back to the panelists for responses. Thank you. Please.
I'm sort of intrigued by a comment made by Susan Pedersen right at the end, and would like the panelists just to sort of give your feedback. You suggested that conflict was displaced outside of Europe. Now, I mean, you could read this Congress is doing two things. One would be that it clearly is true that that peace was confined to Europe. You don't get peace spreading around the world. There's still war and invasion and imperialism going on in other places. However, is it actually getting displaced? Do we get more conflict than counterfactually, had this not occurred, than would have occurred otherwise? Edward Ingram has also sort of suggested there was a so-called export of bellicism outside of Europe in this period. Is that actually the case? And if so, how would we know? And why did it occur that way?
Thank you. Again, please.
This is a question for Margaret, which is,
obviously the U.S. is looking very closely at what's going on with the colonies. And we know that, American President Thomas Jefferson is incredibly frightened by the prospect of, the Haitian Revolution essentially being exported to the U.S. and, slave revolts. So I wonder if she found any U.S. formal or informal input, again, on these kind of issues with the Treaty of Amiens and later on.
And one more, please.
This question is for Margaret or for Susan. Margaret, you talked about as far as it is in the interest of England that France would change its policies with regards to race. And Susan, you talked about the economic interests. I'm wondering if in your readings, if you've looked at the secondary interests, like whose interest would be, who would benefit? Was it the banks, the bondholders? What were the different various interests that would benefit? And is there any recommended reading on that particular subject? Thanks.
Okay, let me come back to the panelists and let them respond to the questions that have been posed. Please, anyone.
Okay, I will start. Thank you for the wonderful comments, and I'm going to start by responding to Susan. And what I would say is that I think that the Congress, in fact, does deal with these issues, and that they deal with these issues through silence. And sort of displacing these issues off into other areas. I think that we have to appreciate the importance of silence. So you don't formally take up an issue. Sometimes the failure to take up the issue is, in fact, the response. I mean, even in our own Congress here in the U.S., right? Sometimes something simply doesn't make it to the floor. And then in some instances, what does make it to the floor is, in fact, designed to displace something, another sort of policy issue that perhaps is undesirable. I think that in the case of the Congress of Vienna, in dealing with these questions of the status of persons, of slavery, of the subjugation of people, I think that that is some of what is going on here. So you can't look necessarily to the formal documents then of the Congress of Vienna, and I think as Christian has explained, you have to look to some of the outside documents. You have to look at what's happening earlier. So I hope that answers that question, but I certainly, response to that comment, I certainly appreciated your point. And absolutely, there is an element of this that the pacification of Europe is dependent on the subjugation of people of color. But I would go beyond that to some of the questions that were raised, that were just raised in the audience here. And that is, I think you have to also see the Congress of Vienna as the first sort of 19th century imperial moment. I mean, the Congress of Vienna, in subjugating people of color, this isn't something that's necessarily confined to Europe alone or in the colonial world, but in constructing racial order, that leaves those regions of the world, whether you were talking about Africa or Asia or Latin America, these regions of the world where people have been racialized in a sort of lower category as perhaps open, right, to imperialism and to direct involvement, and you already begin to see some of this happening in this period. So it isn't necessarily something that emerges, I think, late in the 19th century, but perhaps something that you see already developing here if you accept that racial order is in fact a part of what emerges with regards to imperialism later and these economic dimensions. And certainly it is 100% clear in British documents that their goals are expansionist. Right? They say it, all right? We are interested in the East Indies, in the West Indies, so on, all right? And there's a lot of work now, I can't go into details here, but it's now that takes this global view. And if you open and I think look at the larger picture, take a perspective of Europe that is Europe in the wider world, you already see that wider world emerging, or designs or plans or thinking about that wider world in a 19th century imperialist sense already perhaps emerging here. Why doesn't perhaps develop immediately? Because Europe is economically hurting in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, more than 20 years of war. It has to recover, really, before I think some of this expansion can begin. As for the United States, Yeah, I mean, I think you probably see ruse diplomacy there also when you think about the treaties or so with Toussaint. Yes, Jefferson is in a panic, and so are a host of other Southerners. They are concerned about slave revolt in the South, clearly. And I think you also then have to put other things into context. We tend to think about the legal evolution of the period as separate. We think about legal evolution in the United States as something that's going on in the United States that's somehow disconnected from what's going on in the wider world. But if you look at naturalization laws, which are installed in the United States very much in these years where the French are shifting towards liberty, you see that it is a requirement that you must be white, deemed white, to be naturalized a citizen of the United States. So this racial element, right, which had not existed, I would argue, in the early modern period, not in the fixed way that it comes to exist after Napoleon, is developing in this period, and it is not confined to France, but it is also developing certainly in the United States, and then I would argue in Latin America, in some respects, you see a reaction against it. In fact, the independence movements in Latin America began just at the moment that Napoleon begins to march in, you know, the bearer of slavery, into Spain in the Peninsular Wars, and there is a connection there, but I will.
Yeah, the question of war is a very good question, because if you have no war in Europe, you feel that there is no war. No? Because if you have not a war on your own continent, even if you have it on your own continent, I remember well when we had war in Yugoslavia, in Austria. We had, if you ask a guy today in Austria when was the last war in Europe, we said it was the Second World War. Nobody feels that the Balkan wars were European wars. So if the war is a little bit more far, you don't feel that this is a time of war. And I mean, often is said yesterday and today that with the Congress of Vienna and the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the war was over. But for example, in Latin America, or what we say Latin America, because it was not the name of the time, the independent wars started. The Spanish sent their troops to the Americas with the support of the European powers, not in troops so much, but the ideological support, the support of we have to restore you, we wanted to that you restore it. And this war was done from 1815 to 1825, and we have more than 1 million deaths and more than 1 million wounded people. So we are talking about a real big war, but it is not reflected in the consciousness of the time. So I would say that the war, peace in Europe means not peace in the world. And like we mentioned it yesterday in the Cold War, Cold War means that there's more or less no war in Europe, but there was war in Vietnam, in Korea, in Africa, everywhere. So it's not the time, it's not to talk about this was a peace, completely period of peace. So I think this is important, and I come back to say that the assistance for the independence war, for, you mentioned it, our friend Bolivar, also Bolivar traveled to Great Britain. Also he was a Freemason. Also he got the assistance from Trinidad, because Trinidad is an island in the Orinoco Delta, was a perfect hub to support with military weapons the independence movement of Simon Bolivar. So it is also a British war, the independence war. The most important military assistance was O'Leary, our Irish guy. So you have also this Irish element in the independent war. So I think it is all these independent wars have a very huge European impact and led very, very soon to an imperial policy different in Latin, for America, for South America, Central America, different to the colonial policy of before. So we have really, we can talk about a new order, but it is completely different to Africa. In Africa, we have colonialism in a really old scheme. But for the America started a real imperial policy where you don't found colonies with administration and so on. You send your enterprises now, no? And you do politics by banana republics and so on. No? This is then a completely change of policy, but by the end it has the same effect.
Glenda, Susan, do you want to say any last words?
I think I'd want to stress a few things in that context, and going back to the theme of what adding women might usefully do, so individual women, and I think it emphasises the significance of the arguments that are being made about this as an imperial moment. But if you think about the style, so during the the coalition formation, she's writing a book about her exile, and in it she tells a story about going past the prison where Louverture is imprisoned, and talks about this as an issue that reveals what's at stake in the opposition against Napoleon, right? So for her, it's very clear that the kinds of liberalism that she's articulating as the framework for opposing Napoleon, as imperative for it, includes these questions of not just anti-slave trading, but anti-slavery and the liberty of all people. So now, we still want to make it historically specific, but I think it reminds us that at all these really important, European Congress moments, we know that whether we think of 1919 or 1945, the debates, the historical debates still now are about these moments where, we have a simple question of, a closed, the prison house of empire, or are there choices being made, which sort of makes it even worse when you end up with a system that is, of course, racially defined. But there are interesting, I think, choices and possibilities that extend then into the 19th century in terms of the option of thinking about what is at stake in the questions of peace and security. And it goes back to Stella's argument too about, this larger framework of social justice that's being implied. And that's part of the modernity, so both those paradoxes. Secondly, the bankers' question. And it's true, what's really striking about the Congress is the presence of bankers, both in, of course, the fight against the wars against Napoleon, and then at the Congresses themselves. And, there's still a lot of work to be done on this, but and some of it is coming out, I think, in Brian's work, in his book. But if you think about the shift in political power again, what we see is a move from, the aristocratic privilege to the presence of the bourgeoisie, a banking-backed, if you like, wealth that allows particular women like Fanny Arnstein, Jewish women, who identify as Prussians in her case, to push the argument not just for Prussia and its political claims, but also for the rights of Jews in Europe. So there are really interesting nuances in the kinds of political expectations and ambitions tied with the Congress in this period, and also in the shifting power. And I think Susan's description of the juxtaposition of the increasing publicity of these claims and the relative, marginalisation of women. It's always problematic, but it becomes even more problematic in this period, is a really interesting one. But again, complicated by the different kinds of groups. Once you expand the panoply of actors, you have a very dense, intense, and much more, not just interesting, but politically significant kind of Congress.
Okay, I guess I get the last word. And I wanted to thank you for your comment about is displacement the right way to think about the relationship between, let's say, peace in Europe or the possibility of conciliation between European powers and warfare or violence elsewhere. I want to pose that more as a question than to say I have the answer to it. I don't. But I think what is interesting for me, looking not at this period but as a later period, is how explicit and conscious statesmen were about possible trade-offs there. So I've been doing quite a lot. I did quite a lot of research, though I'm not going to publish anything on it, just out of interest, on the on British internal Foreign Office thinking during the period of the Italian-Ethiopian crisis. And that brings that out very strongly. They are very aware that if they want to hang on to the Italian alliance in a kind of encircling move against Germany, they need to let Mussolini do whatever he wants in Ethiopia. And that is a very sharp, and what I think is it's an interesting moment, because it's the moment when it is not possible for the British to do that, even though many of them would like to. And that is where you start getting the fact that this has become a global system where Ethiopia is a member of the League of Nations, so it simply isn't possible for the British to say, so have it already, that would be fine, even though the prevarication, and you get prevaricating diplomacy that leads to the worst possible outcome, which is they get neither the diplomatic payoff they would like, nor do they come up with a settlement that satisfies anyone. So they lose Italy, and they basically sell Ethiopia down the river. So you have two bad outcomes, and that's a particularly interesting, I think, moment where the discussion is very explicit about whether it is possible to secure comity in Europe by displacement.
I want to thank.
I just had one quick response to the bank question. Maitland's letters are not in the Foreign Office records. They're actually in the private records of the Barings Bank archive.
Fantastic. On that note, I want to thank the panelists and the commentator for a very stimulating session.